Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this month for our webinar. We're going to explore assessment, and with me I have Dr. Christine Poindexter Harris. She is our Director of Assessment and Academic Affairs here at TCS Education System, and she is quite an expert, and she has a lot of awesome things to share with us today. With that, I bring you Dr. Christine.
Thank you so much for having me. As Dr. Newford just mentioned, please feel free to interrupt and ask some questions as we go along. This is really meant to provide some useful tips for you in terms of where are some of these places that we get stuck in the assessment planning process. So hopefully today when we walk away, we'll be able to identify a few solutions to potential stumbling blocks that we see in the assessment cycle planning process. And then as well, start to recognize some of the assessment of student learning outcomes, that it is in fact a continuous process. So it's not something that is one and done, but something that we are continually involved in and having conversations around. We've all seen this wheel, this specific kind of data analysis and assessment wheel, if you will, for student learning comes from the WASC accreditor. So we start at that top of the wheel and we discuss, let's just state what our student learning outcomes are. And whether we're talking about our learning outcomes from the programmatic level, our institutional level, or our course level, we all go through some process where we identify the learning outcomes, and then we have to figure out how do we actually operationalize and measure them. So we identify these methods and measures, align it in our learning curriculum, determine whether or not our students are actually hitting those learning outcomes. And a lot of times it can be difficult because that's where we'll stop. So we'll say, great, I have my program learning outcomes or I have my student learning outcomes. I think I know how to actually measure them. I'll run a course, I may collect some data, and then, yeah, I feel like, or I believe my students are really getting it and they're doing a great job. But we're really trying to push and go beyond that. So when we collect and we analyze our data, how do we then move into action? So at any kind of segment in between this wheel and at these main learning points, what happens is we hit snags, right? We hit these stumbling blocks that sometimes paralyze us in the process. So we will go through some of those today and hopefully figure out a couple solutions to those problems that we have. So just some common stumbling blocks that I've encountered and I've heard from faculty as I work with them and program chairs as I work with them is, I think all of you guys will agree and have heard this one, if not stated it yourself, but lack of time, right? So I don't have time to do assessment, and the comment of, I feel overwhelmed with the idea of assessment, or I'll hear, I don't like assessment. Like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't like assessment. And it's that pushback, almost the pushback that you get from some people if you mention an undergraduate or a graduate statistics course, and people start to cringe. And it's like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's talk about this. And then finally, a big kind of stumbling block that's common, I think, is lack of action, where we can go through most of the process in assessing student learning. But then what are the actual action items that we have, or what have we learned from the data where we can put something into action to make some changes to improve student learning? So this is really the basis for our conversation today. So number one, what are some of the common roadblocks that we hear? Truly this, I don't have time for this. I have real work to do. And what does that really mean? So whenever there are conversations like that, one of the kind of positive solutions that can kind of move that conversation is, let's define real work. What does real work mean? Faculty are extremely busy. Department chairs are extremely busy. In a perfect world, you can sit and you can do your research. You can have TAs who kind of support you and do data entry and things of that nature. Or we have these minions who are going to do all of the work. So when we say, I don't have time for this, I have real work to do, it's taking a step back to figure out what is this real work that we're referring to. And if you ask yourself that question and you really think about it, you're probably coming up with answers or responses such as, I have students that I need to deal with, or I have students who have needs and I need to meet the needs of those students. Well, assessment could probably play a role in that. Or if you're thinking, I'm struggling to get the resources I need for my students. Again, assessment is something that can play a role to help you get the resources for some student support. Or if you just need additional resources so that you can grow as a professional to then make a positive impact in the classroom. Again, assessment can play that role when we talk about the assessment of student learning, because the main goal of assessment is to help us identify true actions that can lead to improved student learning outcomes. And we can't do that if we're not doing some type of an assessment of what's being learned or what's not being learned in the classroom. So that's a huge piece of it. If you're having a lot of conversations around assessment that involve, I don't have time, then part of the conversation can be, where would you like to spend your time? And if the time that you'd like to spend is supporting your students, or you want more faculty support, more resources for faculty, or increased faculty development, by having an assessment of your student learning outcomes and identifying where your students are and aren't learning, that can play a role in those conversations, because then you can specifically identify areas where you may need support, and you'll have the data to back it up. So when we talk about being data-driven, that phrase has been thrown around for decades now, right? But really, assessment can help you identify where you should be putting your resources in order to have an impact for students. And then this is another one. And yes, I threw in this slide as a bit of fun because that's actually me there. But another common statement is, oh my gosh, where do I start? This entire process of assessment is completely overwhelming. I've seen this wheel, I've seen this circle, I know I need to identify program learning outcomes, and I should be collecting data of some sort, but I have no idea what this really looks like. So the first step is create a plan. Create a very smart and thoughtful plan. So getting back to the kind of number one point of I don't have the time, you really do need to carve out time for assessment, right? There is no easy answer for assessing student learning and being able to answer whether or not your students are hitting those learning objectives. You must create a plan, and you must carve out time to have conversations with your colleagues around this. So none of this is being done in isolation. It isn't just the department chair, or it isn't just that one person who's actually excited about the assessment process. It really takes the entire department or the entire program and faculty to come together and work through what is the assessment plan going to be for that program. And then on a smaller scale, when you're designing your course, what is that smaller assessment plan for your course? As you're looking at your course learning outcomes, what are you embedding within that course that's actually measuring whether or not that student is hitting those outcomes? So as you're creating a plan with your faculty, definitely you want to create a larger assessment, a multi-year assessment plan that's in line with your program review. And then you start to chunk it down. All right, you chunk it down into every year. So what do you want to do every single year that's going to lead you to that larger program review or that larger self-study? So remembering, if you just take a look all at once and say, I have to create this assessment plan, this multi-year assessment plan, I need to know exactly what I'm measuring, and I need to know exactly where these measures should come from within the course and within the assignment, and who's going to do that, and when are we going to meet, and I don't have time for this. Wow. Whew. That can definitely be overwhelming. But by taking the time initially to create a well thought out plan, you can save yourself and your colleagues some stress on the back end. It may be a 2-hour meeting. It may be several 2-hour meetings. So getting back to number one, yeah, you don't have time, but you do have time because your overall goal is to improve student learning and also probably to improve your craft as an educator. So once you start to carve out that time and you're creating a well thought out plan of how you want to do your assessment, then you get into the space of, okay, what is our plan? If we already have one, then you're in a great place. Then you can start to ask yourself, are there any gaps in this plan? For example, did we have a plan that we created 2 years ago, but we haven't looked at it since? So perhaps there's some gaps in the data that we need to address. Or do we not have a plan at all? Which can be exciting if you take the right perspective of it, because now you're starting from fresh. So take your time, chunk it out in baby steps, and then see what resources you have around you when you start to collaborate. For example, do you have a faculty assessment committee? Or is there an institutional timeline or calendar that's been developed and created that can help you work through these activities? And we'll start to circle back around to this conversation of resources when we discuss budgeting as well. So the third piece that comes up is this fun notion that I'm in charge of a course. I love teaching the content in my course, and I'm the captain of my own ship. It's my classroom. I may not necessarily be the sage on the stage, but I may be on that path with my students. And it's all about what I'm doing in the classroom. So there's I. But we should always recognize that it's not just us. So we're not just a ship in a bottle that's just operating in isolation. We should be collaborating and having conversations with our colleagues within the department, and perhaps even across the departments in our institution, to talk about what are the larger learning outcomes. So although you may be focusing on your own specific course, how do your course learning outcomes roll up into the larger program learning outcomes? And how do those program learning outcomes roll up into the larger institutional learning outcomes and goals? So we can love being a content expert and we can love teaching our courses, but we just can't stay within ourselves. Just like you can't only have one person who's really, really excited about assessment and the assessment process. That one person can be a champion, but it really takes conversations within the department to get to that longer objective of, are we hitting these student learning outcomes, or are we delivering what we're promising to our students? Right? So again, you can create dynamic course learning outcomes, but how does that play into the larger picture of your program in your institution? So definitely collaborate with people in your department. I think that's a big hurdle that, not even a big hurdle, I think it seems like a big hurdle, but really it's just a small roadblock that you can hop over by having some conversations. And those conversations lead to a greater depth of knowledge, not only for you as a faculty member, but also for the students. But because by having the conversations across your program and taking a look at your larger curriculum map or program mapping, you can see how these courses are related. And you can also see, are there some gaps in the curriculum, or is everyone teaching the same learning outcome in all of these courses? Well, maybe one course doesn't have to teach to a particular learning outcome, and they can focus elsewhere and go a little bit deeper into content knowledge in a different area. There's something to be gained by having the conversations. And it can be, and I can recognize the difficulty sometimes when you have adjunct faculty and full faculty members. So how much time can we allocate, and how much can we allocate in terms of resources and getting everyone together? So I think that can be a fun challenge that's not insurmountable. But again, it's all about the collaboration and how do you want to work together as a department. And then finally, yes, you're the captain of your own ship, but by having those conversations, you can also increase engagement. And when we talk about engagement, we talk about student engagement in the course, but then also faculty engagement, right? So if you've been teaching this course time and time and time again, you have the course learning outcomes memorized, and in your heart, you just know students are getting it. This is where that assessment process can come in and allow you to be a little bit more reflective. You know, are there things that you can change in your course, things that you can freshen up in your course so that you become more engaged and reinvigorated, and then it can continue to allow your students to be engaged in their learning process as well. And of course, share that. You know, are there new ways of learning or even new educational technologies that are infused in the classroom that can help improve student learning? When we're going through this assessment process, so let's say everything is rocking and rolling, right? Our program has already created this multi-year assessment plan. We're in year one of our assessment cycle. We've identified these course learning outcomes and these program learning outcomes. We're looking at, let's say, these capstone papers to see how did students actually do.
So we can have our assessment learning, our assessment meetings, analyze the data, get a slice of pizza, rejoice, have a beer afterwards, and think our job is done. But really, what else needs to happen? So this is where your action plan comes into place. So after you do all of that data analysis, then it's what are we going to do with this analyses? Okay. What actual actions need to come into play? And sometimes I think faculty get overwhelmed with this belief that it has to be this huge, huge change in the curriculum that for it to be in action. Well, not necessarily so, right? It could be that you're swapping out journal articles in a particular class. It could be that you're using a new video for that class that really gets into the topic a little bit deeper. So there are a host of things from a smaller scale that may not cost anything, or it could be something larger where you may realize we really need to sit down and revisit our program learning outcomes. Or you may realize we don't have a clear line from our course learning outcomes to our program learning outcomes, and some things are getting lost. Perhaps we need to have, I know it's time, but perhaps we need to have a couple more meetings, or maybe we can knock this out in a 3-hour workshop. Think about your budget. So if you're going to have a 3-hour workshop, maybe it's a good time to put that line item in your program budget, where you can then go to the CAO and say, hey, I need to get my adjunct faculty in on the conversation because they're content experts. Full faculty is already on board. All of us need to collaborate together. Is there additional money in the budget? Or I'm creating a line item in the budget to help support this half-day workshop so that people can get stipends, we can order more pizza, and maybe this time it's pizza with salad, however you like to do it. But you start to connect your action plans to the actual budget. And the great thing about this is it's another layer of accountability in a positive way, because now you may be getting that monetary resource and someone may ask you later down the line, have you spent those funds? How have those funds actually been used? And then you can say, oh, well, actually, we did have some follow-up meetings. We did use that money. And then also from those follow-up meetings, here's what we learned, and here's now what we're going to do. So there are a lot of different ways that you can move from just having meetings and just having another and another and another meeting, but really being reflective either towards the end of those meetings or in between meetings, so that you can create a full action plan and what that looks like. And remembering that your action plan doesn't necessarily have to be something that can be completed in 1, 2, or 3 months. It could be an action plan that may take 2 years to come to fruition, or it may take 1 year. But having that plan in place and knowing that you need to follow that plan, that's what helps you continuously move forward. And then that final piece of that is go. Once you get that action plan, then, start the scene, start rolling and putting it into play. Number 5 is a big one that I think is very common across the board, but it's, you get to the end of a meeting or a series of meetings or workshops. And sometimes it's like, okay, I'm tired of talking about assessment. I know it's important, but that just negates everything else that was said. And it's, how about we table the topic of assessment until, and then you start to think, well, when's the next accreditation visit? Well, that's not until another 3 or 4 years. So that buys us a little bit of time. Let's keep tabling the discussion. No. Assessment truly is a continuous process. And remember, keep that superordinate goal in mind, or keep that larger themed goal in mind, which is improving student learning, right? So we're all in education for slightly different reasons, but if we listed out our reasons, probably everyone would have something about student learning, influencing learners, something of that nature. So our goal is really to improve student learning. Assessment plays a role in that process. So we're always in that mode. It doesn't have to be at the forefront of your mind every single day, because we're not collecting data that frequently, usually, when we talk about direct assessments. But what you should do is recognize that assessment truly is a process. So we're engaging in it several times a year when we look at it at the programmatic level, and that data and findings and actions at the programmatic level. But every year, we should be doing some type of reflection in terms of how our program is working, or how are our courses going? How is your particular course going? So at the end of that semester, or at the end of the year, when you start to look at your course evaluations, for example, and you reflect upon, are there some changes that I need to make for next semester or next year? That's assessment, right? So even if you're one of those people who say, I don't like assessment, we do assessment all the time, even if we don't want to call it that. So recognizing that assessment is a process, being able to reflect upon the data that you have, the plan that you've created, and how you're doing on the path of carrying out that plan, looking at the actions that you put in place and revisiting those actions to see, did those actions actually make some type of improvement? And then that accountability piece of, one, of course, we're accountable to our students. Are we delivering the education that they told us? But also, if you embedded this into the budget and you asked for some financial resources to support you, then that's another layer of accountability that you have there. And then finally, keeping our colleagues accountable as well. So maybe if someone does want to postpone or table the assessment discussion for the 3rd time, maybe it's time to actually, put that at the top of the agenda. So a lot of stumbling blocks, I'll say, but definitely areas that we can hop over those stumbling blocks. And I like this image of infinity with the holes in it, right? Because it's not a smooth assessment cycle every single time, or an assessment process or plan every single time. There are plenty of pitfalls, but knowing that we can get out of those pitfalls, we can collaborate, we can reflect, and continue to move ourselves into action. That's the key piece there. So don't get paralyzed or stuck or overwhelmed in the assessment process. There are definitely ways to move yourself out of it. Just a couple good resources for you in terms of designing effective assessment. Of course, Bloom's taxonomy gets into there. And then a couple other texts on profiles of different assessment plans that have been put into place, and some pros and cons of their approach. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you found this kind of quick tidbit and toolkit useful for you. And like I said, if you have anything new that you'd like to add to the list, please do not hesitate to reach out.